Welcome to the PGN Podcast. With this podcast, we're looking to normalize the conversation around flooding. What happens behind the scenes, lifting the curtains on the mystery that can sometimes come into play when you're either involved with flooding or trying to protect your home. We're talking to some experts in the industry and relaying some of the experiences we heard from some communities. Hopefully, after our series, you'll have a bit more information to help yourself or help others in an emergency where flooding is involved.
Welcome to this edition of the PGN Podcast. Today we're going to be discussing reporting flooding and why it's so complex. So recording this on the back of Storm Babette and Storm Kieran in the UK, where we had over 130 flood warnings issued in 24 hours and devastating consequences right across the nation. So we've got two very interesting guests here today. So I'm Carl and joined by Meshi.
Hi everyone, and we have Elaine, a senior project manager from Northumbrian Water. Hi Elaine.
Hi Meshi.
Welcome. Tell us more about yourself and your background.
Right, so I'm a chartered civil engineer by qualification, and I've been working as a consultant with the water industry and directly as an employee of Northumbrian Water for the last 26 years. So I've been involved in flood risk for quite a long time, seen quite a lot of changes over the last few years.
Oh, that'd be great. Good conversation there. Go back in time and see how things have evolved and the different amps and all sorts of. Looking forward to it. And our second guest, Nick Hodgson, flood risk manager for Northumberland County Council. Welcome, Nick.
Thank you very much. Hi.
Tell us about you as well.
So a similar journey to Elaine, really. I'm also a chartered civil engineer, started out in the world of consultancy, doing a lot of drainage design. And my current role is the flood risk manager at Northumberland County Council. Our team, day to day, we have two main functions, really. We respond to planning applications to make sure any new developments considering flood risk properly. That's flood risk to the development and any increase that could cause elsewhere. And we also deliver a programme of flood alleviation works to try and protect properties against flooding.
Wow, we're going to have a great time today. So what is it about how things are that could come across as complex and complicated?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and totally agree. It is very complex. Flooding by its very nature is a very complicated issue. There is a lot of different sources of flooding. So you can have flooding from surface water runoff. You can have flooding from rivers, watercourses, the sea, groundwater, as you know very well, is a very difficult issue to manage. So you have all these different sources, and within those, there's different factors that contribute to them being an issue as well. So you might have flooding from a watercourse just because it doesn't have the capacity to take the flow. It might be that the flooding is caused by a blockage in the watercourse. So you have all these different factors that make identifying the source of flooding quite difficult. So that's the first obstacle that a resident had come across. And then moving past that, there's so many different organisations that are responsible for managing that flooding. So you've got your water company, up here it's Northumbrian Water, who'd be responsible for any sewer flooding and maintenance of their network. You've got lead local flood authorities who manage surface water, groundwater, and ordinary watercourses. You've also got the Environment Agency who are responsible for taking that strategic overview, as well as dealing with main rivers and sea flooding. So you've got these various organisations. It's really not clear to your average person who potentially has never been affected by flooding before and not looked into it, who you should be reporting it to, what's caused it, and where to go really in the first instance. So it makes it very, very complicated.
Elaine, anything to add?
I think Nick's covered the vast majority of it there. I would add in that whilst there are a lot of different organisations involved in flood risk management and who have responsibility for that, you can also add into that individual landowners, the farming community. So there's an extremely diverse range of organisations and individuals potentially who have responsibility for managing surface water runoff from their land, the water company obviously managing the sewer networks, and the different responsibilities that each of those organisations have. So for the customers, speaking to people who we've dealt with who have experienced flooding of any description, the overriding message that you do get back is, well, who am I supposed to report this to? And how does, if it's reported to one organisation when actually it's the responsibility potentially of another organisation, how is that dealt with? How is that information shared? And at the moment, that's the thing I think that would probably cause the customers the most frustration, is knowing who to talk to.
It's part of the assumption, though, that there should just be one person. So most communities don't understand them. They're multiple organizations. Then there's the other part of it that the source of the flooding is typically not obvious at the point of reporting.
Yeah. And I think as well, from the customer perspective, the source of the flooding is irrelevant. The customer has a flooding issue at their property, potentially inside their property, and they don't want to become embroiled in identifying who they have to report it to. They would like to report it and have it resolved, and that is entirely understandable. And that's one of the many reasons that we've got the Northumbria Integrated Drainage Partnership in Northumbrian Water's operating area, which is our partnership between ourselves, all of the lead local flood authorities, and we have 14 of them, and the Environment Agency as well, because the flooding that has been identified as sort of single source, most of that has been dealt with now, and we're getting to the point where the issues that now we need to look at and work out how we can reduce flood risk for our customers, the local authorities' customers, the Environment Agency's customers. They're the more complicated locations, and we've all got to work together. They have to be joint funded. We all operate in different funding periods, so aligning funding is an enormous challenge. We're working through it, we're getting there, but it takes time to go through those processes. So I would say the North East we're a step ahead of a lot of the rest of the country in terms of that partnership working, but there's still a lot more to do.
But on the subject of awareness, though, because a lot of this good work that's been done is usually behind the scenes, because you want to get the partners, you want to align your funding cycles, and a whole bunch of stuff. You want to do the research, and yes, there's an element of you can go target the communities and early engagement.
Yeah.
There's a part of this where we rely on visible representation of what we think is flooding. So when you look at the media at the moment, or you look at the news, and we've recently had Barbet and Kieran, you see exceptional events occurring, and we've touched on the fact that flooding can vary in scale. So we're talking about the top end there, where essentially emergency procedure kicks in.
Yeah, and I think depending on the source of flooding depends on how impactful that is, you know, and as you've said, sort of what you see in the news might be extreme events, and you know, I mean, how many of us, Nick, yourself in particular, you know, how often do we have residents that flood and say, oh, well, I shouldn't flood, I don't live anywhere near a river, you know, and there's that education of right, that's surface water flooding. Surface water flooding is a different element of river flooding. And then with groundwater flooding, for example, you know, groundwater flooding can occur months after heavy rainfall, but then it can be a constant and permanent problem that needs to be engineered out, in essence. And even when you engineer that out, there is, of course, a risk that you don't know what that's actually going to do to the, you know, to the ground itself, or potentially cause issues elsewhere. So, you know, I think that's a key part to that understanding the risk and the source of the flooding, but also as well that groundwater mightn't look like much, but obviously that can be a very impactful problem.
It doesn't have that same dramatic shock value as when you see a river up flooding a whole community. It's very, you know, it is very impactful.
It's
when
not
it's
like
when it's almost just a constant.
Tewkesbury 2007, that image on the news.
Yeah, where everywhere is completely underwater. When you just have a bit more of a, and that's obviously affecting loads of properties. When you've got the groundwater that is potentially, I mean, obviously you've seen up here through your study, there is areas that have had really significant groundwater flooding.
Yeah.
But often it is a bit more of an isolated, smaller issue, which makes getting any funding difficult.
Yeah, and persistent.
And persistent, well. It just doesn't go away.
I think as well the river flooding, because I mean the example you've just cited there in Tewkesbury, it makes a big news story because it affects a large number of people suddenly, all in one location.
Yes.
Whereas a lot of the flooding that we're dealing with through the local authorities and through Northumbrian Water, They're much more isolated, but they're not necessarily any less costly to offer improvement to the residents, and that also becomes part of that challenge. You know, our big scheme in the northeast was the Morpeth flood defences.
Yes.
Not something that I've worked on, but that was something that, you know, an event similar to Tewkesbury, and it's a big scheme and it protects a very large number of properties. And I know certainly in Northumberland, in the more rural communities where you have a small number of properties that are affected frequently, it can be really challenging to identify the funding to deal with that.
And again, I think managing that solution of river flooding is different to managing that surface water flooding issue, because, you know, I mean, you know, having lived in York in the past, you expect York to flood, but also you are aware of when that river's going to peak because it's off rainfall falling upstream and you've got a different time to prepare. But if we compare that to, say, surface water on Thunder Thursday back in 2012, or even more recently, Great North Run Day, you know, the water comes as quick as it leaves, and you know, kind of someone sitting there and it's a sunny day. An hour later, they've had water in the house. It's left the house.
Yeah,
but the damage and the anxiety and the mental health impacts last months, years.
Yeah, it's a great example because you see where we've had like Great North Run Day, where you had that mainly surface water flooding, that was relatively off the radar. It was, you know, there was a weather warning in place, but it wasn't particularly talked about. If you compare that to the run up to Storm Babbitt, where it was known it was coming, it was going to be more of a fluvial drizzle event.
Yes.
It was a huge focus.
Yeah, and again, I think that's a difference between short period storms and longer period storms, and the fact you have a weather warning and those longer rainfall events, people can prepare.
Yeah.
And
which makes a huge difference.
Yeah, and I think, you know, the economic damages to those low notice short term events are significantly higher than ones where we have notice. I mean, Elaine, do we know what sort of return periods we were looking at for that one in September?
The 10th of September, the range that you get, some of it is very, very localised. And from memory, the range that you were getting, sort of Gateshead area, about a 60-year return period. Some areas of County Durham, 480-year return period, but over very short periods of time. But you get those super intense, severe events.
Sharp. Yeah.
They are completely outside the design criteria of any sewer network or flood defence when you start to get up into those kind of return periods.
The technical need to talk in terms of return periods, I think there's a reason why we talk that way, because we can quantify and assess the value of some of these investments. But kind of on the subject of the experience of the people going through flooding, what is the value in us continuing to use that language when communicating about the types of flooding, the impact of flooding? Why do we still refer to this event in terms of 60-year return periods and 480-year return periods?
I think it's the definition of the return period of a rainfall event. So it's calling it a 1 in 60, it's a bit of a misnomer. It's a statistical assessment of the likelihood of that event happening in any one year. And anyone that can explain return periods in a clear and transparent manner to the professional community, never mind the layperson, has my admiration, because it's a challenging subject. We all know it's a challenging subject. And those return periods are not fixed. Every time it rains, your data set moves a little bit.
Recalibrates.
So the more and more intense storms that we have, something that you designed to protect property from a 20-year return period 10 years ago, if you reassess that now against the current data set, that might only provide protection for a 15-year event now, because the data set is bigger. And that's a tremendously hard thing to explain to people. I think the reason that we stick with it as a way of quantifying events, our funding is all linked to those return periods. And each organisation, another complication that we haven't mentioned in flood risk management, is that different types of flooding for different organisations attract funding for different return periods.
Yeah.
So, for example, if you look at flood defence grant and aid funding through the Environment Agency, which is what the local authorities will apply for their projects, you will look at what is the most cost beneficial return period.
Yeah.
It could be up to 100 or a 200-year return period.
It could be taking something from, say, 1 in 30 to 1 in 50
Exactly,
as well. Yes.
as long as it offers benefit. Within the water industry, through how we're funded, and obviously that funding comes from customers' bills, which there's always a lot of conversation around, we're funded for a much lower return period to provide an operational sewer network. And so we're looking more at sort of 1 in 20, 1 in 30, 1 in 40-year return periods.
Mm-hmm.
There's still a cost-benefit element to that, but we are not funded to provide that service for the higher return periods. And that is another reason why working in partnership is a fantastic thing for us to be doing, because it puts both of those funding sources together and it brings more resilience to the sewer network, and it enables us to, we could go in and deal with the sewer flooding issue and fix that to the level that we have funding to do. And those people could flood again 2 weeks later on a 100-year return period because we are not funded to provide that. If we work together, we have a much better chance of addressing that more holistically.
Absolutely. And doing schemes as local authorities, we have to address the issue of surface water, but there may still be a sewer flooding problem in that area. But also as well, through new development, developers are expected to be building developments to a 1 in 100 standard plus climate change. How important is this climate change allowance, as it were?
Well, I think it's very much fair to say that any new development now that's going in is going to have a much more capacity than most of the existing infrastructure out there. So as you touched on, totally incorporating that 100-year return period. So the chance of the storm that had happened, you've got a 1% chance of that storm happening in any given year, plus generally a sort of 45% allowance for flows, as Elaine touched on, if you were to design something.
And again, that's changed from maybe 10 or 20% less than a decade ago to 45%. And that's not taking it from 1 in 100 to a 1 in 145. That's applying 45% more volume of rain. Another thing about this process as well, which is interesting, and again for the audience, is we have to understand exceedance routes as well. So when or if the structures to manage these developments fail, where does that water go? Where does that exceedance go? Yeah. And again, how important is that?
Yeah, it's critical really, because obviously you can design for a 1 in 100, 1 in 200, whatever, but there is always a chance that that's going to overtop. So you do have to consider what will happen when it does. It's crucial. And it's not just the fact that you might have a storm that is larger than the design event. You could also just get a blockage at the outfall or something simple that does have quite a high probability of happening. And if that floods, that's going to cause issues elsewhere. So really, really important that it's considered.
So I'll take this back a step. When we talk about, we look in the space of new development. So when we talk about exceedance, can you talk through to our potential listeners how we look at development sites? So flood zone 1, flood zone 2, flood zone 3, what does that mean? And when we say flood exceedance, what do we mean by that? And what are the type of mitigation measures that we would consider for a new housing development or something? Yeah,
so the basic premise is that we would design, or a designer working for a developer would design up a system to take a certain amount of flow, but there might be blockages, there might be events that exceed the capacity of that. As Elaine touched on there, you get events that are way beyond 1 in 100 from time to time. That's always going to happen. So we need to make sure that through planning, that if a basin or a drainage system, a flow control, whatever blocks, that there is going to be an overland flow route that's going to go somewhere that's not going to cause a problem to properties where possible. Obviously, there comes a point where you can't fully design everything out, but all reasonable steps should be taken to make sure that any overtopping, any excess rainfall that's beyond the capacity of the system will flow onto highways or fields or away from residential properties and people, not putting other people at risk.
And again, I think as from a local authority perspective, particularly when we're looking at new development, there's a demand to build houses. There's that balance of putting it in, say, flood zones against building in the green belt. You know, and if we are building in the green belt, there is that additional impermeable area, but likelihood is it's uphill from because we've started building from the river and sort of built upwards. The likelihood is those green belt areas are uphill of existing communities, and how important is the planning process in ensuring that they are not new developments are not detrimental, not just to the people who are going to be living there, but the people who live around them.
Oh, it's huge. It's a common misconception as well that it's something that we probably grew up going to school hearing, that flooding is caused by new housing developments, that you're paving over green fields, that's adding flow to watercourses, communities downstream, causing a problem. And that certainly was the case in the past. Now through planning, the National Planning Policy Framework's been strengthened. There's a lot more guidance out there on what should be done. So now by properly considering how a site's going to drain, it means that flow risk, the flood risk downstream, shouldn't be increasing at all, really. Generally, we'd look at, or again, a developer's consultant will look at what the flow off the undeveloped site is going to be, estimate that, and then make sure that they restrict the flow from the new development to the same or less than what would have run off the site before. So that means that downstream, although we do have a huge increase in impermeable area where you're going to generate a bit more runoff from the site than a natural site that have let it soak in, it means that you've got the same flow rate passing downstream, and all that extra water is stored on the site in basins or other attenuation features.
Yeah, and Elaine, how does that how does these new approaches to new development integrate with Northumbrian Water's sort of vision, as it were, and how infrastructure is managed as well?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of focus on new development and the impacts of new development. And as Nick's already described, the impact of new development on the network is minimised by the legislation that exists around new development and around planning and around flood risk assessment. So obviously, anyone who's putting together a new development, they have to make applications to their local water company for connections, both for their drainage and for their water supply, and that all gets dealt with through our new development team. I think the new development side of things in terms of flood risk for the water company is far less of an issue than how we actually deal with the existing infrastructure.
Legacy.
The legacy is, the networks that we have are a legacy of how good the Victorians were. And I think all credit to the Victorians. What they did was an amazing feat of engineering and a fantastic thing for public health, because that was the driver when those sewer networks were originally constructed. What the consequence of that is that the Victorians, generally speaking, their sewers were built along the routes of existing watercourses, and everything went into them. So you would continue to carry the flows from rainfall through the streams that they would have originally been, and then everything else, foul drainage, all got tapped into that system. So we have what we call a combined sewer network, and that is a legacy that is true across the whole of the UK. And I think dealing with that on a day-to-day basis and the understanding of how that operates is actually something that is not well understood by the general public.
No. Absolutely.
So whilst we have new developments that are constructed on a separate network, so you'll have a separate system for surface water and a separate system for foul drainage, more often than not, if those developments are part of a regeneration and they're in a sort of like a pocket within an existing urban environment, the system that those then connect into will be a combined system, unless you can identify a route to get it to a watercourse or to a surface water network. So the drivers sort of that Northumbrian Water has now is that we're trying to apply more sort of nature-based solutions to flood risk issues that we have, trying very much to get back to replicating how the land would have drained itself before it was urbanised. And that's easier to do in some locations than it is in others. So it's always, at the moment, it would always be a policy of keeping surface water out of the combined network because it reduces flood risk, and it also reduces treatment costs, capacity. It's far more resilience built into the system if we can do that, but it's challenging.
And I think one thing, you know, being within the industry, there's probably some things we all take for granted, and I think, you know, what was happening in the 60s and 70s, it was just, you know, direct sewage out into the river, and then we built the interceptor, you know, and can we just explain to the audience what the interceptor is, and
as in locally along the Tyne?
Yes, locally along the Tyne. Yes.
So that was a project. I think it was definitely before my time, but I have worked on part of the project that sort of was the final cleanup, if you like, of the Tyne. So as quite rightly as Carl says, historically everything just went straight into the river, and obviously over time we have become far more environmentally aware. During the 70s, I think we had the interceptors along the south bank and the north bank of the Tyne. So essentially a huge tunnel that carries all of the sewage to Howden, which is on the north bank of the river, including a siphon that goes under the river from the south to the north. The projects that I was involved with, which was back in sort of like the late 90s, was what were called the Tyne Outfalls projects. And that was a series of over 100 small pumping stations that were installed along the river on both sides to pick up all of the property between the interceptor and the riverside and to bring that back up into the interceptor as well. So that kind of project of installing the interceptor and cleaning up the river was ongoing for a period of probably 20 to 25 years. And it's made a huge impact on the Tyne and similar projects across the UK. And that's as environmental legislation has come in and environmental awareness has come on a step. I shall open the can of worms that is combined sewer overflows at this point as well, because that's the current focus, isn't it, of the general public.
I think before you jump into combined sewer overflows, just on the point there of the scale of work, not just the investment, but the duration to actually divert these outfalls to treatment. And 25 years, can you imagine the disruption to the communities?
Yeah, I think, I can't remember the exact figures, but there has been sort of an estimate done of what it would cost to completely re-sewer the UK into separate systems. And I think you're talking hundreds and hundreds of billions of pounds. I can't remember the number off the top of my head, but it's an untenable thing to do. So we're working with a legacy system, and we have to do that to the best of our abilities.
Manage the load into the system.
Yes.
So now it's sewer overflows, the combined sewer overflows.
The combined sewer overflow, which is a hot topic amongst it's become a little bit of a political football, to be honest, as well.
It has. But for the listeners and those watching this, let's start with the fundamentals, because you've been really good with telling us the basics. But so explain the role of the combined sewer. What is it?
A combined sewer overflow. So essentially you have a piped network which carries flows from houses. It'll pick up things like highway drainage. It'll deal with rainfall when it comes through the system as well. And it has a finite capacity. So the system has essentially pressure release points at certain points to allow those flows to escape the system to the environment, rather than those flows ending up inside people's homes. So the primary driver of the system is to ensure minimal sewer flooding that impacts property, primarily residential property, but also commercial property. So without those overflows, those opportunities for the system to kind of vent during severe events, we would have significantly more sewer flooding within people's homes to deal with. And that obviously is not the way that we want things to go. So that's the legacy of the combined network, is that you have to have those vents to the environment to be able to keep people's homes safe, essentially.
Yeah, and again, I think, the CSOs are in place at particular strategic points on the network, and that surface water, ultimately from rainfall that gets into this system, can surcharge out of the sewer miles away in essence from where that rain fell. So what can we do on the network to without the separation system? You know, as you said, it's basically, it will cost hundreds of billions or trillions of pounds, I think. What can we do?
So there are all sorts of initiatives that have been ongoing for a number of years, for sort of how can we make the most of the system that we already have. And that, again, is something that the water companies have been working through for as long as I can remember. We have smart networks that we're looking to implement. So that basically, it's an intelligent network that uses the capacity that we do have to the absolute maximum. So keeping as much as possible contained within the system as opposed to spilling to the environment. So I think part of the legacy of the pandemic is that there has been a significant rise in awareness of environmental issues. There's been an upsurgence in open water swimming and use of our sort of our water environment for recreation, and people have become far more aware of how those systems operate and how we use those systems. So the driver at the moment, the most recent legislation that's probably been in place for sort of 2 years now, is a driver towards combined sewer overflow, reduction of spills, and a much, much more stringent standard of operation for those overflows to reduce those spills to the environment and improve river water quality and bathing water quality. So the bathing water is generally coastal areas. So there's a huge, huge programme of investment coming into those. There has been a huge programme of investment historically as well, but there is a step change coming in the next 5-year period that we have in what's called AMP8, our asset management period. So that's 2025 to 2030. And there's been a lot of advanced investment in getting us set up for that as well. So we're not waiting till 2025, that's happening now.
A lot of the CSOs are consented. So could you explain what we mean by consented overflow, what that could mean?
So this is where the Environment Agency also comes into play as the regulator for pollution and control of pollution into those watercourses. So every storm overflow will have a set of documentation that goes with it, and I'm by no means an expert on this. It's part of what I deal with, but yeah, not something that I get involved in terms of the actual consenting procedure. But there is a legal document that goes with each overflow, which is set up by the Environment Agency and the water company, which says how frequently that overflow is allowed to spill. So those exist, and it's set around frequency of spill as opposed to the volume of spill. So I think the current standard has been a maximum of 30 spills per year. The new legislation reduces that to 10. So there's a huge amount of work to do.
But also with the AI intelligence coming in, it will allow better reporting and monitoring of the spills essentially.
Yeah, and we already have on all of those CSOs what we call event duration monitoring. So that's monitors which will tell us when those overflows go off, how long they go off for, and that kind of information is already shared with. It's publicly available information. So things like the Rivers Trust website, which maps CSOs and spills, things like Surfers Against Sewage, who use data that's provided to them by the water companies to identify when there are spills occurring and things like that, so that the public have access to that information.
You've both talked about the NIDP, and I think it's time we give the NIDP a platform.
Yeah.
So I'll go to Nick, because you've just been listening to us. I'll go to you first. What is the NIDP, Nick?
So it's the Northumbrian Integrated Drainage Partnership. That's the first tick.
Tick, yes.
So it's basically a collaboration between Northumbrian Water, the Environment Agency, and lead local flood authorities in the area to work together to try and tackle these integrated issues. As Elaine says, it's a huge problem. There's lots of isolated single source issues out there that are generally quite well managed. It's quite easy to put them in a box and deal with them. There's not always an easy solution, but it's clear who should be managing it. But we have so many issues that it's a countrywide thing. It happens everywhere. where an issue doesn't quite fit into the box of it's just surface water, or it's just highway flooding, or it's just a sewer, or it's just a river. There's issues where, for example, a lot of our highways through Northumberland and elsewhere, while the highway drainage, the gullies, are the responsibility of the council, the network that they connect to is actually owned by the water company, so Northumbrian Water up here.
Yeah.
So where we have issues like that can be exacerbated by surface water runoff from the catchment. So, you'll have huge areas that shouldn't necessarily be draining into Northumbrian Water's network, but do, where we have issues that are really heavily linked and not really suitable for just an individual organisation to tackle them. So that's the ethos of the NIDP, really, to all work together to try and manage these complicated issues.
Yeah.
And just to add into that as well, that this was kind of like the brainchild of someone at Northumbrian Water sort of 12 years ago, I think now. Martin Kennedy from Northumbrian Water, who was our sustainable sewerage manager at the time. He's retired now. He will not like his name being mentioned, I'm sure. But it came about as a series of pilot projects that were done predominantly in and around sort of like the Newcastle city centre area, looking at these integrated issues. And there are projects that came out of those original studies. We have a project that we've done at Brunton Park in Gosforth, and one at Killingworth and Long Benton, where we've looked at getting sort of water course out of our system, making sure that we separate surface water and the foul drainage in those locations, and making use of attenuation that we have in the existing lakes and making use of the existing features that we have. But part of the reason for the NIDP being set up was it enables access to funding for the local authorities as well. So what we do is we look at a whole drainage catchment, which is sort of an area defined by Northumbrian Water's system. We call them drainage areas. We look at a whole drainage area. We have 400 and odd of them. So there's a lot to go at. And the agreement was that we would do the study stages of identifying issues and prioritising integrated issues. And that would be funded on a 50-50 basis at the study stage by Northumbrian Water and through flood defence grant and aid funding through the Environment Agency, which the local authorities apply for. Now, that's regardless of who we actually think the issue may or may not belong to, because you've got to start somewhere. So a commitment was made to a 10-year programme of studies, funded 50-50, to get to the root cause of the flooding issues that we have. And that's probably the biggest challenge. Once you've got to the root cause of why the flooding is happening, what's causing it, what source it's coming from, you can then be far more confident in actually implementing a solution that provides flood risk reduction consistently at those locations. So once we've gone through a study stage, we've done a feasibility study, we've looked into the sort of options that we could put in place to reduce flood risk. Only at that point, when we've identified proportionately with how much we think the water company benefits from the project and how much we think the lead local flood authority benefits from the project, and this goes back to who is responsible for which network and which bit of flooding, then we make a proportionate split of the capital contribution towards the project. So we start off 50-50 until we've fully figured out what the problem is. When we've identified the root cause of the problem, we then split the cost of investment appropriately between the organisations. Yeah. And it gives a springboard as well in doing that initial stage where we identify all of the issues in a catchment. We list them all out. We identify how many properties we think are impacted by each of those issues. And some of those may well belong in their entirety to Northumbrian Water, so those will go back into our programme. Some of them will belong in their entirety to the lead local flood authority because they're surface water issues. Those can go back into their programme. But that opens the door to the application for more grant and aid funding for those single source issues for the local authority as well. So it's an enabler to draw down more funding to deal with those things, because the grant and aid funding can't be used in its entirety for the study stages. You've got to have quantified the issue, haven't you, to apply for that funding.
And an integrated approach has to be applied.
And it opens the door to a significantly larger amount of funding if you can demonstrate that an integrated approach has been applied.
But building on that process though, sorry Carl, just building on that process, the sheer action of these different risk management authorities coming together in partnership and kind of working as a combined team has the benefits of information sharing as well. So you talk us through that process, please.
Yes. So in order for us, GDPR has been the elephant in the room for a long time, hasn't it? In
Spell
terms
out
of
GDPR, please.
GDPR, so that is the legislation, data protection regulations.
General data
protection regulations. So that is protections for our customers about sharing information with other organisations to ensure that we're not sharing personal information that we shouldn't be sharing, essentially. And when that first came in, I think there was a lot of nervousness around what you could and couldn't share. And I think we've, over time, all of the different organisations have, it's not something that should ever stop us from sharing data that needs to be shared. So, for example, the flooding events that have happened in recent times, the 10th of September, for example, each organisation will get reported flooding that is not there, in inverted commas, flooding. And it enables us to share that information to the organisations that need that information to do their day-to-day work, essentially. And it means that we all have the full picture of the reported flooding that is happening, and that's significant. And that is something that hasn't always existed, and we're in a far, far better place now with that than we ever have been before.
I think as well with these studies, when we go through the stage 1 study, the hope is always that it's going to lead to a scheme that with a business case that stacks up and we can get the money in to deliver that. But sometimes that just doesn't happen. The problems that we come across are just too great, really, to be able to fund sufficiently. Yeah. So in those cases, it's the information that comes out of those studies that's really useful, because it helps us identify the risks, quantify them a bit more, and that can help us speak to communities, help them improve their resilience, even though it might not lead to something that's actually going to be built to solve the problem, address the source. It's still good information for people to have, to know that they are at risk.
It can identify other beneficiaries to the project as well. If you've got a major industrial organisation that happens to be within a catchment that will benefit significantly from a project, it opens the doors to identifying other people and organisations who may wish to contribute towards a scheme as well. So
and I think, firstly, Nick, you've spoke excellent about the NIDP, and I think you might have just had to put yourself up for vice chair there.
Easy to do when it's such a well-run
obviously,
come on.
Obviously, as chair of the NIDP, I do have to say it. Obviously, it's 10 years old. It's award-winning. We've been referenced in national guidance and advice in the Jenkins report, but also as well, I think it's important to explain that when it started, it was predominantly on engineering projects and solutions, but over the last couple of years, we've really started to try and take that in a new direction, and I want to just kind of take a minute to celebrate and promote those wider benefits we have as a region. So firstly, the fact that we've got 16 risk management authorities there, 14 local authorities, the Environment Agency and Northumbrian Water, we use it as a great knowledge share, as we talk to each other about different problems, commonalities, etc. But also as well, it's became a mechanism to allow us to upskill, to be better trained. When we have a very challenging skill shortage, and upskilling our staff is critical to how we operate, particularly with future challenges coming in. But also as well, it's a great place where we've sat down and we've looked at problems together. And one key element I'd like to celebrate as part of that is the fact that when the call for funding for the FCRIP programme, which is obviously what Project Groundwater Northumbria is part of, we all sat down in COVID times on Teams meetings, not in person, and we came up with ideas for potential projects, and we submitted 6 bids, combined talking about it, 5 of which were successful. And, there is a value in that, but also as well, looking forward to the future, we're taking it away from just projects. We're looking at how we can help look at things like sustainable drainage, planning, working more with people like transport and highways and resilience. But also as well, who else can be part of the partnership, or who else can be involved in the steer? And, we're looking at people like Net Zero North East England. We're doing a lot more engagement with people like, Natural England and the Coal Authority. And I think we've got a very exciting future ahead as a partnership as well. And we need to keep thinking and evolving out of the box, and we always need to stay almost one step ahead. So, yeah, I
totally agree. And I think it is, when you think of the NIDP, or generally when we think of it, we're thinking, yep, it's us partnered with Northumbrian Water, partnered with the Environment Agency. But it's a really good point that having all the local authorities in the area have a forum to be able to engage with each other and discuss things. It's really important, because within not so much in Northumbrian Water, but within local authorities, the flood risk team is often, it's a very small part of what the council as a whole does.
Yeah.
So it's great that we can all get together, discuss ideas, almost be part of a bigger network than...
Yeah, and we've spent a lot of time talking about the positive of the engineered drainage network here. But Nick, obviously, Northumberland County Council, you've obviously got urban areas like Ashington, Blythe, but there are a lot of rural areas, and the natural drainage network is a key element. So your ordinary courses and your main rivers, and you've mentioned the EA with responsibilities to the main river, but there's a term, riparian owner,
yes,
and ordinary water courses and overland flows. Can you explain that and how different that kind of flood investigation and flood reporting process is in a rural area to, say, an urban one?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So to touch on some of the terms there before we dive into that, you've got the ordinary water courses, main rivers. Generally, the bigger rivers are managed by the Environment Agency. Smaller ordinary water courses are the responsibility of lead local flood authorities. That's not to say, though, that the lead local flood authority is fully responsible for maintaining those, and that's a common misconception, really. And it does come a little bit back to those overall responsibilities. So to go slightly off topic, but I will come back on topic. If you think of the highways network or Northumbrian Waters network, they're responsible for those. The highway authority is responsible for the highways network. Northumbrian Waters is responsible for their network. If there's an issue in those, if there's a blockage, they would be responsible for dealing with that. Whereas while the lead local flood authority is technically responsible for managing flood risk from ordinary water courses, that doesn't mean that we would clear those blockages. So that comes down to the issue of riparian ownership. So basically, if there's a water course that's not a public sewer within somebody's land, then the owner of that land is the owner of that water course, and they're therefore responsible for managing that.
Can I jump in there?
Yes.
So there is a scenario in there where you have two landowners on either side of a water course. So can you explain how that ownership is split?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you've got a water course running between you and another landowner, then each of those landowners would be responsible up to halfway on the water course, responsible for keeping it clear, maintaining the banks. And it does often happen where people don't actually realise that the stream at the bottom of their garden, even sometimes just beyond their fence, if that's forming the boundary between the properties, they are still the riparian owner.
Yeah.
And while a lead local flood authority would be responsible for managing that risk, it generally does essentially refer back to being a private issue between landowners.
And then it's not just open water courses as well, of course. It's culverts, it's piped water courses.
Exactly,
so for example, where you've got this natural water course and it's going under a number of back gardens, for example, that is actually still a responsibility of a landowner.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
And
it's an issue that we do see. Obviously, Northumberland being a very rural area, we do have a lot of small water courses that people maybe didn't quite realise were culverted through their property, or it's an old historic issue that's never come to light before, and then all of a sudden it does. So it can be quite a shock to people.
Yeah.
Is it one of the reasons why, obviously, when you buy a house, you get your historic maps and things? It's one of the reasons why we need to pay more attention to that information.
Yeah, absolutely. It's certainly something that if it's out of sight, it's out of mind. If people haven't flooded before, they'll think, oh, great, it'll be lovely to move out to the country. There's a nice little stream down there. That's great.
Yeah.
Without potentially paying full attention to understanding their responsibilities.
And you've mentioned out of sight, out of mind there, just to digress, we'll come back to that. But I think when you've mentioned out of sight, out of mind, I think when we are looking at flooding and flood risk and the problem, there is this conception from residents, the public, even businesses, even highway engineers to some respect, that if we get all of that water in that system and underground as quick as possible, that's the problem solved, which it's not.
Absolutely not. It can either exacerbate problems downstream for someone else, which isn't great, but often these old systems just don't have, even if you could get it in there, it wouldn't have the capacity to take it. So it's never going to be quite the solution just to try and pipe everything away as quickly as possible. Which kind of goes back to planning in that
exactly
in the past it was very much, right, we've got a new site, we're going to get this water, get it into Northumbrian water system, not our problem.
So we're learning, we're learning and we're improving. And just getting back to the riparian ownership there. Obviously that's for ordinary water courses. Is it the same for surface water? Do people still have responsibilities to accept and allow discharge?
Absolutely, yeah. So there is no responsibility on the landowner to attenuate any natural runoff from their land within their site. So there is a responsibility on landowners to protect their own property to a degree without making it worse for others. There's no real... A common issue we see is that you'll have a farmer's field or you'll have some agricultural land, undeveloped land, and it does generate quite a bit of runoff during really extreme events.
Sheets off,
Exactly. And there's no, people would expect that potentially, well, that shouldn't happen. That needs to be dealt with. The council will sort that out. But there isn't any, the landowners are often not doing anything technically wrong. Now, obviously there is cases where they've changed the management of their land, or they've blocked a water course, or they've done something that has created a problem. Potentially. And once a landowner has engineered a point of discharge, as it's termed, and diverted water somewhere else, then that's a slightly different issue. Where there is some fault.
But a deliberate discharge. It would be.
Which is not acceptable.
How do we adapt better with the issues that we already have? So we've talked about how new developments, we have checks and controls in place, but you also described we still have housings that were built with combined systems. We have a lot of estates with misconnections, and I'll let Elaine describe what misconnections is. So we have a legacy issue that's still very current right now. So how can we address that? How can we address that with our communities, get our communities to be part of the solution? Should I start with you, Elaine?
Yes, of course. I think education, and this podcast is part of that. It's an assumption. General public, they flush the toilet. They don't think about where it goes, and
nor should they
need to. It's a service that's provided, isn't it? But there's an expectation that will always happen, and I think it's an education about how we use our systems, how we use water, how we reduce our water consumption, and there's a lot of focus on that to actually sort of. That in itself brings more capacity into the network. If we can reduce usage, then it enables us to actually, we've got more longevity in our system because we've got more capacity. We've talked about things like smart networks as well, in terms of us as an organisation managing our resources to the best of our ability as well. But I think a lot of it comes around a knowledge and understanding of how what we all do as individuals impacts on those systems, and to not take them for granted. There's an awful lot of our infrastructure that we just expect to be there and expect it to work. Nobody talks about water supply networks or sewer networks until something goes wrong. So it's sort of how can we as individuals assist in that resilience piece as well? Obviously, the organisation is responsible for those networks. We have got a big part to play in that, but so does every single individual that makes use of those systems as well.
And that comes down to asset management as well,
Nick?
The future is all about resilience, as well as, we will continue to build defences, maintain assets, make sure everything's ticking over. But it's things like making people aware. So the Project Groundwater work it's like exactly that kind of thing that will give people a bit more, just ways to be resilient, really. so communities can have a better
Yeah,
warning, they can prepare better, instead of just constantly trying to build higher walls and bigger bunds.
And again, it's about mitigate. We can only mitigate. We can never prevent. And there needs to be a social acceptance of that. There's obviously a lot of expectation on engineering a solution and almost being shovel ready as soon as an incident happens. Obviously, you know, the NIDP 10 years old is kind of a demonstrator that we are aware that flooding's occurring, but you need to find that right solution to be most effective. And that's from all sources for as better standard of protection as possible. And I think that's important.
I think what the NIDP has demonstrated through the partnership is you can bring different stakeholders with their own agendas together for joint outcome. How can we bring communities more into that space? Like you say, grow your partners. How can you pull in your community action groups? How can you pull in like all these different people, saying that they too can play their role, but also you're bringing your communities with you, because these are people that can get rooms and get people to listen outside technical speak.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the things that the NIDP has done, Carl's already mentioned about the 5 FGRIP projects that have come to the region, which is partly a consequence of all of those connections already being in place between the different organisations and enabling us to put the bids together with the EA's support in a timely fashion. And I'm going to reference one of the other projects now. So, for example, the project that we were looking at in the South Stanley and Craghead area of County Durham, the NIDP project has spawned one of the FGRIP projects, which is, I'm probably going to call it the wrong thing now because it started out being called SUDS Plus, and I think they've rebranded themselves slightly since. I mean, all of these FGRIP projects are projects that are being implemented within the region, but with the aspiration of national application, aren't they? So they're looking specifically at sustainable drainage within a community, and how can sustainable drainage features. So this is bringing sort of surface water management above ground, making it visible, taking it away from being out of sight, out of mind, to actually make it something tangible, and finding ways that you can engage the community to implement it, to use it to generate income. And I'm quite looking forward to seeing the sort of the outputs from that. And it's engaged all of the local community groups in that. And it's about getting buy-in from the community, so there is ownership within the community of those kind of projects.
Yeah, it's having advocacy for the asset. Yeah.
We're doing this piece at the end of each interview. We call it the Crystal Ball Ideas Corner. I'm going to work on that title, I think. It's a bit but the idea is we've been talking about the NIDP and its growth and its how it's kind of established itself over the last decade, which I think is really great. But what about the future? So, Elaine, you have considerable experience. You've seen the AMPs come and go. You've seen CSOs part 1, part 2, now part 3. You've seen all types of flood alleviation schemes and resilient projects. What is the one thing that you'd like to see if there were no objections and no red tapes as a form of transforming flood management for the future?
Single organisation responsible for flood risk management across the board.
That was an easy one, wasn't it? Like straight in there. Nick?
I think it's something we've already touched on, but I think just more and more focus on resilience and making sure that, because we can never stop all the flooding, there is just something there that communities can use for themselves to be a bit more resilient, which part of the FGRIP projects, it's all about that really. So yeah, just ways to help people manage flooding when it does happen and prepare for it. Absolutely, yeah.
Thank you both for joining us.
Thank you.
Very informative. Loving the definitions today. We had to do that though, because I think part of the challenge when we talk about flood management is not just the acronyms, the terms we use. Thank you for being game for taking us through the tutorial on what some of these things mean. But I think it's been a great show.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you for coming.
I'm really hoping that these podcasts are going to become a great resource for sort of customer information, actually.
But yeah, thank you so much. It's been great.
No, thanks. Yeah,
thanks for the invitation. It's been good.
Thanks for listening to the PGN podcast today. We hope you found it informative and enjoyable. If you did, Please like and subscribe to the podcast, but also please, if you find this useful to anyone else, pass it on and spread the word.
To find out more about Project Groundwater Northumbria, please visit www.pgn.org.uk.